When it comes to the states or political entities of Star Wars, it's easy to look at a big galactic calendar and say the Empire's reign started in 19 BBY, then it ended in 4 ABY with the Battle of Endor. But when it comes to the actual practical structure of the government in the galaxy across that period, things are a lot more complicated than they appear. The ending date is probably the more obviously fuzzy element. Sure, Palpatine died, but it's not like the entire government immediately dissolved. Imperial still controlled Coruscant, most worlds would still remain under an albeit fracturing empire for another couple years, and the rebellion would take quite a bit of time to begin setting up their own real successor government. But even on that front end at 19 BBY, it wasn't like the Empire was declared and then suddenly all of the institutions we understand as being Imperial, whether it's the office of the Emperor itself, the Moffs and Governors, the Imperial Fleet, the ISB, and any other element you can name popped into existence fully formed. Today what I want to focus on is that element of increasing Imperial power and when the Empire reached its apex. When exactly did we hit peak Empire? After all, not only was the centralization of power a climb rather than an immediate transition, the loss of power was a slower descent as well, or at least it was a series of important cliffs, rather than one drop-off on a graph mapping directly to how far Palpatine had made it down the reactor shaft. Horrible idea to put access to that in your office, by the way. The radiation exposure alone I can't imagine is good for you. As we track the ascent of Imperial power, it's worth noting that institutionally, the structure of the Empire the day after Palpatine declared the New Order was really more similar to the Republic during the Clone Wars than it was to the Empire as we see it in Episode 4 or 5. And many of Palpatine's actions over the course of the war had been setting the stage for the type of state he had in mind already. The transition of power from the Senators to the new Moffs began with the way control over the Clone Wars was structured. A big part of this involved the use of Emergency Amendment 121B, also known as the Reflex Amendment in 21 BBY. This particular amendment allowed greater control from the Chancellor's office and from the Grand Army of the Republic when it came to responding to Confederacy attacks without requiring either Senate oversight or local cooperation, hence the name Reflex Amendment because of the faster responses. So initially, a lot of the local forces were controlled by their own admiralty, and one example given in Star Wars Insider is the Chandrillan Home Defense Fleet moving from local control under Hiram Drayson to being under the authority of Cole Searden, an appointee of the Central War Council. Drayson was kept in an advisory role, but his authority and that of Mon Mothma as the local senator was significantly curtailed. This represented a return to the military governor-generals known as Moffs, which had been appointed from time to time throughout the Republic's history, but with the additional authority of the Reflex Amendment, the transition to the Imperial version of the Moffs, as effectively the full political authority in a sector operating with the Emperor's blessing, was underway. This amendment, and others like Statute 312B, which granted core and inner worlds greater voting authority than the Rim, were willingly passed by the Senate itself, and it's important to note that the Moffs are not necessarily a one-to-one replacement of the Senate's authority. The Moffs were effectively the executive branch, with the Senate remaining the legislative branch. But as Palpatine took over more and more power, the executive at this federal level was able to take over quite a bit of the authority of the legislative branch as well. But again, this was authority which, for the first while of Imperial rule at least, Palpatine needed the Senate to willingly cede if he wanted to maintain control. Willingly may be too strong of a word for this. While some, like Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, were brave enough to openly oppose Palpatine, a lot were probably being coerced into liking this video and subscribing for more, or at least they were coerced to lend Palpatine their votes. As power slowly made its way into the Empire's hands, other institutions within the Empire began to pop up. Some were technically formed on day one of the New Order, like the Imperial Security Bureau, or ISB, which was spun out of what was now Imperial Intelligence and the former Internal Security Bureau. But even then, it didn't technically spring fully formed out of nowhere. There was precedent under the Republic previously. A big part of what made the ISB possible to be implemented as soon as it was the former Committee for the Protection of the Republic, a semi-official political advocacy group sponsored by Palpatine's office, and which advocated for centralization and humanocentrism, pushing a lot of the ideological side of what became the core of the Empire. It was itself reorganized into the Committee for the Preservation of the New Order, or COMPNOR, after the declaration of the Empire, and many of its leading figures found new positions among the Imperial elite. This included Croya Vandran, who helped establish the ISB, and it also included future Grand Admiral Ishin Ilraz, who was appointed to that position purely for political purposes, given he had absolutely no experience as a military leader. So while the ISB didn't technically exist in that form before Day 1 of the Empire, a lot of what it was doing was being done in different forms by the intelligence division that existed before, or the Internal Security Bureau, and then a new twist was put on it by putting in the leaders from Comp Or. The destruction and removal of the Jedi from any official power with Order 66 certainly represented a major step in the formation of the Empire, allowing Palpatine to solidify his personal position as Emperor, but as things stood, it wasn't like he was going to be removed by a vote of non-confidence anyways. His position wasn't any more or less secure than we saw thousands of years earlier with Contus Bex I through the 19th as the dynastic leaders of the Republic during the Pius Day Crusades, effectively another time the Republic became an empire in all but name. It's tempting to put the peak of imperial power sometime in Episode 4, between the dissolution of the Senate and the destruction of the Death Star. Aside from the fact that the Death Star itself was so expensive and such a blow to the image that the Empire was invincible, the loss of longtime leaders like Tarkin, Yularen, and probably some of these other losers, I guess, was a huge institutional hit, so I think it marks a definite endpoint. I think you can have a lot of good arguments for when exactly the peak of Imperial power was, but I really don't think it can come after the events of the Battle of Yavin. The Empire may strike back after that, but this is the moment it feels like the true institutional fragility which breaks up the Empire after Endor comes in. If the Death Star doesn't explode here and Palpatine just dies later, it would be possible that Tarkin, or especially Tarkin and Vader, could have kept the Empire slightly more united than Sate Pestage and Isard managed to, though of course it wouldn't fix the fragility inherent to the Empire. It just means the one other guy who could fill a role similar to Palpatine would still be around, which is kind of helpful. That being said, while I think you could argue the dissolution of the Senate represents the final victory of Palpatine and means we've reached peak Empire then, I actually think the events of Episode 4 show the Empire was probably actually past its peak at this point. The dissolution of the Senate and the destruction of Alderaan in particular feel more like some scrabbling attempts to regain power from a system already in decline. The Senate may in theory represent some semblance of democratic institution Palpatine didn't have full control of, but as we've already established, they're a mix of toothless and complicit. What's more, having the Senate stay around even in this toothless form probably has a public placating effect. People who are aligned with Palpatine's goals can still pretend they are in some way represented, but once the Senate is gone, any pretense of democracy is gone, and then the senators and the populace who feel like they may have had some way to challenge Palpatine through the system are going to be harder pressed to make that argument. It's also why when the very stupid Shopify CEO talks about how Canada should scale the amount of votes you're able to cast in an election to income tax paid, he may be able to hear La Marseillaise in the distance. So yeah, maybe by leaving the Senate around, you're leaving some possibility for an opposition group to form within it with some amount of legitimacy, but you're also kind of drawing a final line in the sand. You're potentially putting more power in the hands of the Empire, but you're also making it more brittle and showing that there is no way to oppose what they want to do internally. So it can mean absolute power has been achieved, or it can mean you're actually not as in control as you might hope. Like Leia says, the more they tighten their grip, the more systems will slip through their fingers. And the destruction of a core world certainly didn't help make people with misgivings more likely to support the Empire. There's a reason this led to some of the most effective organization against the Empire afterwards. It's hard to think of what the Empire may have wanted to do, which stories set before Episode 4 don't show them already being able to do, even if they may have found the Senate kind of annoying. So while this is slightly less of a fixed point for peak Empire than just labeling it as sometime within A New Hope, I do think we can put it within a couple years before that, and I think on that basis, I would call the dissolution of the Senate a huge misstep by Palpatine and Tarkin, and likely the real beginning of the end for the Empire. Let me know what you think in the comments though. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.